Dusk lay over Châlus, a modest castle in the hills of Limousin, too small to deserve a king's attention, too stubborn to be ignored. The walls were rough stone, the sort of fort a determined lord might cling to even when the world has moved on without him. Torches flickered along the battlements, smoke drifted low across the siege camp. The air smelled of wet earth, sweat, and old ash. I stood near the front because that is where I always stood. If you want men to hold a line, you don't ask them to die from the safety of a pavilion. You let them see you. You let them measure your courage with their own eyes. I had done it 100 times, 1,000. I had lived as though the rules of ordinary men did not apply to me. I had ridden through storms and sickness. I had walked through the smoke of burning cities. I had fought on foreign sand and returned, again and again, as if fate itself had signed a treaty with my name. On the wall, a crossbowman moved in the torchlight. Not a knight, not a noble, just a man, maybe hungry, maybe terrified, maybe proud enough to pretend he wasn't. In my mind's eye, I still see him clearly, the way he crouched behind the stone, the way he lifted the weapon as if he were aiming at any other target, as if I were any other enemy. There are stories people tell about men like that he used a frying pan as a shield, that he laughed, that he prayed. Stories grow like weeds around a battlefield. The truth is always simpler. He aimed. He fired. Thup. The bolt struck my shoulder. For a heartbeat, everything went silent in my head. The camp, the shouts, the clang of work, the distant creak of siege timber, all of it fell away, as if the world were holding its breath to see whether a king could bleed. Pain came second, hot, immediate, personal. I did not fall. I would not fall in front of them. My men needed a king, not a warning. So I did what I had trained myself to do since boyhood. I mastered my face. I mastered my voice. I turned and I walked, slowly, deliberately, back toward my tent as if nothing had happened. Behind me, the siege kept breathing. Men kept working. Orders were still shouted. The world pretended for a few minutes that I was still untouchable. Inside the tent, the light was warmer. Candles, a brazier, maps on a table, the smell of wax and smoke and ink. It should have felt safe. It did not. The bolt was still there. I reached for it the way a soldier reaches for a problem, to rip it out and keep going. I gripped the shaft and pulled hard. The wood snapped. I stared at the broken piece in my hand, stupidly surprised, as if I had not broken 100 things in my life. The iron head was still inside me, buried deep, quiet as a secret. That was the moment the curtain truly fell, not on the battlefield, not on the wall, in the small space between one bad choice and the consequences it invites. When the surgeon arrived, he brought linen and instruments, and that steady, hard calm men carry when they work near death. They held me still. They cut deep. They searched. They pulled. The pain was not heroic. It was not noble. It was real. It was heavy. It was the kind of pain that makes you understand how thin the skin is between a king and a corpse. The iron head came free with a sharp clink into a dish. For a moment, I could breathe. For a moment, the tent seemed to widen again. The candles stopped swimming. The air stopped choking. And then the fever began to creep in, like a thief testing the locks. You hear strange things when fever comes. Sometimes it's just the camp beyond your tent, a guard coughing, a horse stamping, wind snapping canvas ropes, but sometimes it feels like something older is in the room, something that has been waiting a long time for you to stop moving. My family has always carried stories. Some kings are born into prayers and saints. My line, the House of Anjou, carried something sharper. A legend of a woman too beautiful, too strange, who hated the church and vanished through a window with two of her children. A demon bride, a mother of monsters. That is what people whispered. Maybe it's nonsense, but in the dark, with sweat on my skin and firelight trembling, the story did not feel like nonsense. It felt like a shadow standing just out of sight, smiling because it had finally caught up. All my life, people called me Lionheart. They spoke the name as if it were armor, as if courage was a shield you could never lose, as if a title could bargain with disease or steel or time. I had believed it too, not in words, in posture, in habit, in the way I always stepped one pace closer than was wise. Now, lying on that bed, I understood the oldest truth of war. You can survive 100 battles and still be undone by one bolt from one man on one wall. And in that fevered quiet, 4 names rose up like pillars holding the roof of my life. Henry, my father, the builder of our empire of scattered lands and brittle loyalties, the man who could outthink a room full of barons and make them thank him for it, the man I had fought, the man I had broken, the shadow whose name never truly left my shoulder. Philip, King of France, my mirror and my opposite. Where I was flame, he was a blade. Where I wanted a decisive clash, he wanted time. He would rather win with parchment than with blood. And he was good at it, good enough to make even my victories feel temporary. John, my brother, the one who always stood behind the story, waiting for the moment the story stumbled. He was not a fool. He was not weak. He was patient in the most dangerous way. Patient like hunger. And then my own name spoken softly inside my skull. Richard. If I was truly the useless king people like to mock, if I was only a warrior chasing glory and leaving my realm to others, why did my enemies fear me so much? Why did the world hold its breath when my ship vanished from the horizon? Why did men still tell stories about me, even when the stories were ugly? Maybe the answer is simple. Maybe the answer is not about England or France or the Holy Land. Maybe it is about what people want from a king when the world feels dangerous. They want someone who steps forward, someone who does not flinch, someone who makes the chaos look smaller by the sheer force of his will. That was my gift. That was my curse. Because a man who believes he is made for great deeds begins to believe he cannot be stopped. He begins to treat danger like a servant. He begins to think even death will wait until the work is finished. But death does not wait. It does not care about banners, or bloodlines, or songs, or the way your name sounds when people chant it. It only cares about that small, blunt sound. Thump. And as the fever tightened its grip, I stared into the darkness and understood that my story was about to turn back on itself, back to where it began, back to family, back to the first wars, the first betrayals, the first choices that made me into the man who stood too close to the wall. Because if you want the truth of Richard the Lionheart, you don't begin with a crown. You begin with a father who built an empire out of land and threats. You begin with brothers who wanted what they believed was theirs. You begin with a rival king who learned how to win without fighting. You begin with a boy who learned early that power is not what you are given. It is what you can hold. And I held it for as long as my body would allow. Now, the question is not whether I was brave. The question is what bravery costs when the bill finally comes due.
If you want to understand why my name still echoes, why Lionheart survived all the arguments about taxes, languages, and absence, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to a battlefield, not to Jerusalem, back to the strange, crowded heart of what we called a kingdom, and what was really a family holding a continent by the throat. I was born in Oxford in the year 1157, on English soil, yes. That fact annoys people who want the story to be simple. They like the neat version where I'm a foreign adventurer who never belonged. But medieval power didn't work like modern nationalism. A king wasn't from a place the way a merchant is from a town. A king was from his blood, his oaths, his God, and the land he could keep. For my first years, England was home. Stone halls, cold mornings, the smell of rushes on the floor and smoke in the rafters, priests murmuring Latin, soldiers clinking in mail. I don't remember it as a comfortable childhood. I remember it as training. Even in peace, we lived like men who expected war, because war was always arriving. My father, Henry II, didn't just inherit a realm, he built one. He stitched together lands through marriage, inheritance, legal skill, intimidation, and sheer stamina. England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, names people later tried to squeeze into a single label, empire, as if it were one solid country. It wasn't. It was a chain of possessions, each with its own laws, its own powerful lords, its own sharp edges waiting to cut the hand that held it. And the hand that held it was Henry's. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of proud barons and walk out with what he wanted. Not always because they loved him, often because he made them believe resistance would cost more than submission. He understood something that most warriors learn too late. Battles are expensive. Agreements can be cheaper. Fear can be cheaper still. My mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was his great prize and his great complication. She brought him the South, wine country, poetry, sun, and rebellion. Aquitaine was beautiful and impossible. And because of her, I belonged to more than one world from the beginning. That's what people miss when they argue about whether I was English enough. What does that even mean for my century? In England, the ruling class spoke a form of French, Anglo-Norman, because the Norman conquest had reshaped the court. Latin was the law of language and the church. In the South, people spoke dialects that sounded nothing like the French of Paris. A noble child like me would have heard several tongues around him. Could I speak English fluently? No one can prove it either way. But in truth, it barely mattered to my peers. Kings were judged by rule, war, justice, and luck, not by whether they could trade jokes with farmers. There's another idea people forget. In many cultures, a king is expected to be a little bit foreign, a little bit other, different enough to stand above local feuds, tribes, and grudges. If you look at medieval Europe honestly, you see that foreign queens were normal, foreign dynasties were normal, and the court moved across borders like a traveling storm. The king wasn't a familiar neighbor. He was a figure of power, half political and half sacred. That sacred side mattered. People traced bloodlines the way they traced rivers, backwards, endlessly, towards some source that would prove the right to rule. I had a thread of old English royal ancestry somewhere deep in the family tree. People loved that kind of claim. It made the crown feel inevitable. And then there was the darker story, the one my house carried like a secret badge. The tale of the demon bride. A woman of impossible beauty, so perfect she didn't seem human. A woman who hated the church, who would not endure the holy walls. A woman who, when forced to attend, seized her children and vanished through a window, never to be seen again. The Counts of Anjou, my ancestors, didn't always deny this. Some even bragged about it, as if being touched by the monstrous made them more powerful. You might laugh, you might call it superstition, but I grew up in a world where bloodlines were political weapons. If your enemies whispered that you were descended of devils, you could either flinch or you could let the rumor become fear. And fear, in the right hands, is a kind of armor. Still, none of that made me the heir to England. I was not supposed to be king. I was the third son. My father's plan was practical. My older brother, Henry, would inherit the crown. The rest of us would inherit pieces of the wider domain, duchies and counties, so that the family would hold everything together. On parchment, it looks tidy. In real life, it was a nest of vipers. Because men don't like to share power, even brothers. And that's where Aquitaine enters my story like a blade. As I grew, my attention moved south. My father made me Duke of Aquitaine, and that title was not a gift wrapped in silk. It was a war assignment. Aquitaine's lords were proud, restless, and used to acting like kings in miniature. They didn't want an overlord. They wanted distance. They wanted freedom. They wanted a chance to test whether the young prince sent from the north could be broken. That was my classroom. Not a schoolroom with books, though yes, I learned letters, Latin prayers, music, and the courtly arts. I learned songs. I learned the rhythm of verse. I learned what nobles were expected to know. But what shaped me was the real education. Horses, steel, siegecraft, and the politics of force. A medieval knight is not made in a year. He is made by repetition, by bruises, falls, blistered hands, and the slow hardening of instinct. You learn what armor does to your balance. You learn how far you can push a horse before it breaks. You learn to read the ground, the wind, the faces of men about to flee. Most of all, you learn that a title means nothing until people believe you can enforce it. Aquitaine taught me that. England gave me a cradle. Aquitaine gave me teeth. And above everything, my father's vast, scattered domain taught me the cruel truth of the Plantagenet world. Every border is a weak point. Every loyal lord can become a rebel. And every moment you look away is a moment someone else reaches for what you hold. So when people ask later, why was Richard remembered as a legend when he spent so little time in England? I think they're asking the wrong question. The real question is, what did my world want from a king? It wanted a figure who could hold that fragile chain of lands together through fear, confidence, and victory. It wanted someone who could ride into chaos and make it obey. It wanted a king who felt larger than ordinary men. That expectation of being different, of being dangerous, of being chosen, was built into me before I ever wore a crown. And once you understand that, you can see how the next disaster becomes inevitable. Because a family like mine, ruling lands like ours, could never stay peaceful for long. The storm was already forming, and I was already learning how to become it.
Civil war doesn't begin with a trumpet call. It begins with a family argument that refuses to die. In the early years, my father, Henry II, did what powerful fathers always do. He promised, he delayed, he kept control. He expected his sons to accept their futures the way soldiers accept orders. But we weren't soldiers, not yet. We were young men with titles, pride, and a taste of what power felt like. And once you taste it, being told to wait feels like being told to starve. So the storm broke in the year 1173. My older brother, Henry, people called him the young king, wanted more than ceremonial dignity. He wanted real authority. He wanted to rule now, not later. My father wanted him to keep smiling, keep touring the realm, keep accepting applause, and keep obeying. It was the kind of mistake that seems small until it burns the whole house down. When the rebellion started, it didn't stay in one place. It spread like fire across dry grass. Lords who hated my father for one reason or another suddenly had a banner to rally behind. Old grudges found a new excuse. Foreign kings, especially the King of France, watched with the quiet excitement of men who smell blood. And then there was me. I was still a teenager when I was pulled into it, dragged into a world where the people closest to you can become your enemies overnight. It's easy for later generations to judge. They see sons rebelling against a great king and imagine it as selfishness or spite or childish impatience. Sometimes it was. But it was also something darker, the nature of our inheritance. We didn't rule a neat, unified country. We ruled a patchwork of lands bound by personal loyalty, oaths, and fear.
If the family cracked, the realm cracked with it. And once that crack appears, everyone tries to widen it. I remember the feeling of being spirited away to safety, to the French court, while the world around me caught fire. It wasn't bravery that carried me at first, it was survival. I watched older men talk, negotiate, threaten, and bargain. I watched how quickly alliances shifted, and I learned a lesson I never forgot. In politics, friendship is often just a weapon with a smile. The rebellion dragged on, bitter and exhausting. When my mother, Eleanor, was captured, it felt like the last thread of family warmth snapped. It pushed me toward reckless action, one of those bold strikes you make when you think boldness can substitute for strength. It didn't. My father outmaneuvered us. He did what he did best. He offered terms from a position of power. He made concessions that looked generous, then tightened them later. He understood that a king doesn't have to destroy his enemies if he can tame them. One by one, my brothers folded, and in the end, I was the last still resisting. There's a story of me finally surrendering, throwing myself at my father's feet, weeping and begging forgiveness. People like to repeat that scene as if it proved something humiliating, but it proved something else. I was young enough to think the family could still be stitched back together if I just submitted, if I just accepted my place, if I just stopped fighting. My father spared me, and then, almost casually, he handed me a task that would have crushed a weaker man. He sent me back to Aquitaine, not to enjoy it, not to celebrate it, to hold it down. Because that rebellion had stirred up the South like a nest of hornets. Barons who had tasted revolt didn't want to go back to obedience. They wanted to keep taking, keep raiding, keep acting like rulers. They were sponsored and encouraged by the King of France and by anyone else who wanted to see my father's dominion break apart. Aquitaine became my cage and my proving ground. This is where the myth of me begins to have teeth, not in the crown, not in the crusade, in the long, grinding work of siege warfare and discipline, castle after castle, road after road, negotiation when it worked, force when it didn't. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't clean, it was mud, blood, and stone. And yes, there were punishments, harsh ones. The medieval world didn't treat war like a private duel between noblemen. War bled into villages, it ate churches, it turned whole regions into wasteland. Mercenaries and raiders were hated because they lived like wolves, feeding on the weak. So when men were captured, sometimes they were not ransomed, sometimes they were mutilated, sometimes they were killed. That wasn't an exception. That was the language of control in a world where law only mattered if someone could enforce it. I'm not telling you this to ask for forgiveness. I'm telling you because you can't understand the century I lived in through modern comfort. You have to understand how brutal the stakes were. If you didn't make fear, someone else would. In those years, I became what I was always going to become, a specialist in siegecraft. When you siege a fortress, you learn patience and geometry. You learn how to starve a wall. You learn how to break morale without breaking your own men. You learn where stone is strong and where it's brittle. You learn to measure time in days of digging, weeks of hammering, months of waiting. And then, sometimes, the moment comes when everything must be decided in minutes at the gate. That's when a commander's reputation is forged. Over time, Aquitaine began to bend, not because it loved me, but because it learned what I could do. And just when I was starting to believe that the worst was behind me, the family war returned, meaner than before. In the early 1880s, my brother Henry, the young king, rose again, not just against my father, but against me. He aligned himself with rebel lords in Aquitaine, and he had powerful friends pushing him, especially the young and ambitious king of France, Philip. It was betrayal layered on betrayal. Imagine what that feels like, fighting to hold a land, bleeding for it, and then discovering your own brother is encouraging your enemies because he thinks it'll increase his own share. That second rebellion was a lesson in speed and ruthlessness. I hunted down forces that threatened my territory. I struck quickly before they expected me. I rode hard, even through winter roads, pushing horses to exhaustion because hesitation meant letting rebels gather strength. There are chroniclers who describe my actions in that period with a mixture of admiration and horror. They talk about how I dealt with mercenaries, how little mercy they received. Again, not because I was uniquely cruel, but because mercenaries were seen as a disease in the countryside. They weren't noble opponents, they were paid hunger with weapons. And then, suddenly, the rebellion broke, not through my sword, but through sickness. My brother Henry fell ill and died. It was as if the story itself had shifted its weight. One death, and the entire line of succession changed. Overnight, I went from being a troublesome son and a hard-fighting duke to being the heir to England. In other families, that might have brought unity. In ours, it brought a new fight. Because my father, Henry II, did not stop being a strategist just because one son died. He looked at the chessboard and tried to rearrange it. He wanted to take Aquitaine, the land I had spent years pacifying, and hand it to our youngest brother, John. That was the moment I understood something about myself, something that would define my entire life. There are things you can bargain with, and there are things you cannot. Aquitaine wasn't just land. It was my work, my identity, my proof, my scars. The place where I had become a commander, and where men had begun to follow me because they believed I could lead. To give it up, to hand it to John, who hadn't bled for it, felt like being asked to hand over my own spine. So I refused. And that refusal meant I was willing to risk everything. My relationship with my father, my standing in the wider realm, even my future crown. This is the part of my story where people like to paint me as arrogant, or stubborn, or overconfident. Maybe they're not wrong, but imagine being told after years of war and sacrifice, now give it away, because it's convenient. A man can forgive many things. He does not forgive the erasure of his own labor. So, as the 1880s rolled on, Aquitaine remained restless, France remained hungry, and my family remained dangerous to itself. The war that began as a son's impatience had become something larger, a struggle over whether my father's vast dominion could survive the ambitions of the men meant to inherit it. And in that struggle, I was no longer the boy who begged forgiveness in the mud. I was becoming something harder. Not yet a king, but already a weapon. And the world around me was beginning to understand just how sharp that weapon could be.
Philip was never like me. I was fire, impatient, obvious, loud when I had to be. Philip was a knife, quiet, precise, and always meant for a soft place under the ribs. Where I wanted a decisive clash, he wanted time. Where I wanted the story to end with a battle, he wanted it to end with a signature. And for a short, dangerous stretch of my life, we needed each other. When my father tried to reshape the inheritance, when he kept pulling the crown away from my grasp, when he toyed with giving Aquitaine to John, I looked for leverage. I found it in Paris. I found it in Philip. People love to gossip about what happened between us. They repeat lines from the chroniclers as if they are scandal, as if sharing a table and a bed must mean the same thing in every century. But my world didn't draw the same boundaries yours does. In the 12th century, men shared beds because rooms were cold, because space was limited, because privacy was a different idea. And sometimes, especially among nobles, sharing a bed was a gesture, public, deliberate, a way to say, we trust each other, we are one. That was the point. Not romance, politics. Philip and I staged unity as a weapon. We ate together. We spoke together. We made my father look at us and see the future closing in. And it worked. Henry II, my father, was brilliant, but even brilliance has limits when the family turns into a battlefield. He could manage barons. He could manage bishops. He could manage foreign kings. But managing his sons, that was the one war he could never fully win. By the year 1189, Philip and I were no longer just irritating. We were a threat. We pushed him hard enough that his health failed,
hard enough that in July of that year he died, still a king, still formidable, but brought to the edge by those closest to him. There is no clean way to say this. I climbed onto the throne by helping to drive my father into the ground. People want to believe kings rise by destiny, by justice, by the will of heaven. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they rise by a family's ugliness. That is the truth of my crown. When Henry died, I didn't give the world the grief it expected. I went to where his body lay, and I stood there, silent. Whether that was sorrow, or numbness, or shame, I won't pretend I know. The truth is, a king doesn't get the luxury of collapsing, not when the realm is already trembling. Because the moment I became king, I inherited 3 crises at once. First, I had to secure England and the wider Angevin lands. The realm needed order. Officials needed to know who held authority, and every opportunist needed to be reminded that the crown was not empty. Second, I had to prepare for a crusade. Jerusalem had fallen, and Christendom was in a frenzy. Whether you believed in the holy cause or simply feared the shame of refusing, the pressure was immense. The age demanded a great expedition, and kings were expected to lead it. And third, I had to watch Philip, because Philip was not my friend. He never truly was. He was my ally the way a wolf is your ally when you both want the same carcass. England in that moment actually liked me. My father had grown unpopular in his later years, partly because of taxation and the strain of his many wars. I arrived like a new beginning. I made gestures that mattered, releasing some prisoners, restoring confiscated lands, rewarding loyalty. I wanted people to feel that the old king was gone and the new king was different. And then came the accusation that has followed me for centuries, that I robbed England blind to fund my crusade. This is where we have to be careful, because people love simple stories. The story they tell is that I raised crushing taxes and treated England like a purse to be emptied. They repeat a famous line, that I would sell London if I could find a buyer, as proof that I didn't care. That line exists as a kind of joke, a cynical boast, and it became a symbol. But the reality is more practical and more medieval. I raised money the way kings raised money, by squeezing the system. Offices were sold, yes, sheriffdoms, posts, privileges, but that wasn't the bizarre invention of mine. It was part of how royal government worked. Positions came with profit and influence. Lords were willing to pay for them because they expected to earn more in return. What I did differently was speed. I turned over a great many posts quickly, like compressing a decade of appointments into a short period. It was brutal in its efficiency, but it wasn't mindless. I still cared who held power in my name. A reckless king would sell offices to anyone with a bag of silver and let the realm rot afterward. I didn't do that. I put capable men in key roles, men who could keep the machinery running while I was gone. Because yes, I was going to be gone. That's another charge people throw at me, that I didn't govern England because I wasn't physically there. But medieval kingship wasn't about sitting in one palace signing papers all day. It was about securing loyalty, maintaining justice through officials, and being present where your power was most threatened. And my power was threatened everywhere. England was only one part of the inheritance. Normandy and the continental lands were constantly under pressure from France. Aquitaine was restless. The whole structure depended on movement, on intimidation, on quick responses. Even so, I didn't leave England as a vacant house. I left it guarded and organized. I built a framework that could survive my absence, because I had to. And that brings us back to Philip. He looked at my crusading preparation and saw opportunity. He had taken the cross too, publicly, because it was the fashion of the age and because he could not afford to look small. But Philip's heart was never fully in the Holy War. He was too practical, too focused on France. To him, the crusade was leverage. To me, it was something else. Part faith, yes. Part ambition, yes. but also a chance to be what the age worshipped, the perfect warrior king fighting a cause that didn't stain the soul. So in Aquitaine, I had fought Christians. In the Holy Land, I could fight the enemy of Christendom and be praised for it. So while I gathered ships and silver, while clerks wrote and seals were pressed, while England watched and judged, the great drumbeat behind everything, and the alliance with Philip, already strained, began to splinter in ways that would never be repaired. We had another problem as well, a long, embarrassing betrothal. For years, I had been promised to Philip's sister, Alice. She had lived at my father's court, effectively a hostage to secure agreements. And then rumors spread, persistent, ugly rumors, that my father had taken her as his mistress. Whether every detail was true didn't matter. The smell of scandal was enough. To marry her would have been to accept humiliation, to accept a tainted bargain, and to invite endless whispers about legitimacy. So, I refused. It was a political decision, and a personal one, and it was an insult Philip did not forget. In the winter 1190, we were in Sicily with the crusading host, English and French armies forced to share space, supplies, pride. It was a pressure cooker. Small incidents became riots. Hunger sharpened tempers. Every banner felt like a provocation. I handled it the way I handled most things, decisively. When disorder threatened to swallow the expedition, I imposed order, hard, fast, and visibly. That kind of action makes soldiers loyal. It also makes rivals resentful. Philip resented me more with every day. And then I made another move that widened the crack into a rift. My mother, Eleanor, brought me a new bride, Berengari of Navarre, a strategic marriage to secure Aquitaine's southern borders. Not a love match, a calculation, but it meant I was ending the long betrothal completely. Philip left. He sailed away from Sicily, leaving me behind with the crusade and leaving our alliance in pieces. And in that moment, I understood the trap, because Philip could now return home, free of the crusade's burden, and do what he did best, scheme, bribe, and attack my lands while I was far away chasing salvation and glory. So as my fleet prepared to sail east, as the Holy Land pulled at every vow and every ego, the great rivalry of my life settled into place. Philip was no longer my ally with a smile. He was my enemy with a plan. And I, Richard, was about to sail into a war that would make me a legend, while my rival waited in the west, ready to carve my inheritance apart the moment I looked away.
By the time we reached Sicily, the crusade already felt like a kingdom on wheels. Thousands of men, tens of thousands if you count the sailors, servants, camp followers, merchants, and priests who travel wherever armies travel. Ships crowded the harbors, horses stamped in muddy pens, barrels of water and wine rolled across planks. Every day was a negotiation with hunger, weather, and human temper. Messina was beautiful in the way a knife can be beautiful. Stone walls, narrow streets, a harbor full of masts, markets alive with noise and suspicion. Sicily wasn't just a stop on the road to the Holy Land, it was a pressure chamber. Two great armies, English and French, forced into the same space. Two kings who didn't trust each other, and a city that suddenly had to feed a force large enough to swallow its stores in days. Prices rose, bread became smaller, wine became thin, people began to panic. You can feel a riot before it happens. It's in the way voices change pitch, in the way crowds stop moving smoothly and begin to surge. It's in the glances, quick, hard, between strangers deciding whether today is the day they will take what they can. I tried to solve it like a commander, not with speeches, with structure. We secured supplies,
We took over a storehouse, yes, even a monastery at one point, because war doesn't care whether a building is holy if the men outside it are starving. We set rules, we enforced price controls, we threatened punishment for thieves, gamblers, and anyone who tried to profit from chaos. But tension doesn't always obey rules. Sometimes it obeys only the first spark. One evening, in the middle of a conference, French leaders, Sicilian officials, my own men, noise rose from outside like a tide, shouting, metal clanging, the sound of a crowd deciding it is no longer afraid. We were still speaking, still negotiating, when a messenger burst in with news. Fighting had broken out. The lodgings of one of my allies were under attack. People were being dragged into the street. In that moment, talk became useless. Philip's reaction was exactly what I expected from him. He stayed seated. He kept his hands clean. He offered nothing but cold distance, as if disorder was someone else's problem. I stood up. I took up my sword, and I went out. I didn't go out alone. My household knights followed, men who had fought beside me for years, who understood that a king who hesitates in a riot loses more than a street. He loses the idea of authority. We moved fast, pushing through narrow lanes choked with bodies. Torches burned, smoke rolled along walls. I could see fear in faces that weren't used to seeing a king in the midst of violence. There is a version of this story people love to tell, where I conquered Messina in an hour, as if it were some heroic tournament. The truth is uglier and simpler. It was a brutal, chaotic struggle to reassert control. My men fought hand to hand, people died, some of my own household troops were killed, and the city learned very quickly that I would not be negotiated with when the streets were burning. When it was over, my banners flew over the walls, just long enough to make the point. Philip demanded I lower them and raise his instead. He wasn't arguing about morality, he was arguing about status, about equal partnership, about who got to look like the leader of this crusade. So I compromised in a way that kept the peace while still proving who had acted. I replaced the royal banners with the flags of the military orders, Templars and Hospitallers, symbols that neither Philip nor I could claim as personal trophies. Then I did what actually mattered. I stabilized the city. I took hostages from prominent families, not out of cruelty, but because hostages are the medieval version of insurance. I built a wooden fort overlooking Messina, a silent reminder that the city was being watched. I imposed discipline in the camps, public discipline. Men who thought they could gamble away order were whipped. Sailors who caused trouble were punished. Harsh, yes, but the alternative was a crusade that tore itself apart before it even reached the Holy Land. This is why soldiers loved to follow me. It wasn't because I was gentle, it was because I made chaos smaller. But Philip watched all of this with a growing quiet hatred. Then came the breaking point that turned irritation into a permanent wound. The question of Alice. I had been promised to Philip's sister since childhood. Politics welded into marriage as usual. She had lived in my father's household for years, and by the time I became king, the rumors around her were poisonous. That my father had taken her as a mistress, that she might have borne him a child. Whether every detail was true or not, the scandal was enough to make marriage impossible. I refused to marry her. To Philip, it was humiliation twice over. Not only was I rejecting his sister, I was exposing a shame that reflected back on him.
It didn't matter how politely we spoke about it, the insult lived under every word. So Philip left Sicily. He sailed away, leaving me with the Crusade and leaving our alliance in pieces. Then my mother arrived. Eleanor, 70 years old and still sharper than most men half their age, stepped on Sicilian stone like she owned it. With her came Berengaria of Navarre, the bride I would marry instead, a political match, a southern alliance, a woman who would become queen and yet barely touch the kingdom she was queen of. We were still in Sicily. Lent kept us from celebrating properly, but the marriage was set in motion, and with it the final severing of my connection to Philip's family. At last we sailed. The fleet pushed out into the Mediterranean like a moving city. Sails filled, ropes strained. The sea opened ahead. And then the sea reminded us who truly rules the world. A storm rose fast and violent, the kind that doesn't negotiate. It scattered ships like leaves. Waves slammed hulls, men clung to ropes with bleeding hands, horses screamed in terror below decks, lanterns swung and died, the wind tore at canvas as if it were paper. In the chaos, some ships vanished into darkness, others limped away damaged. The fleet that looked unstoppable in the harbor suddenly became a collection of isolated, fragile lives at the mercy of water and wind. That storm didn't just scatter our ships, it scattered our plans. Berengaria and my sister Joan were blown off course. Their ship drifted towards an island I hadn't planned to touch at all, Cyprus. And in the darkness of that storm, while I fought to keep my own vessel afloat, I didn't yet know that the Crusade had already been reshaped again. By chance, by weather, and by the kind of opportunist who waits on shore for wrecks. Because by the time the sea calmed and I learned where they had been driven, I would be faced with a new enemy. Not Saladin, not Philip, but a lesser tyrant with a greater mistake. A man who thought he could seize my family and bargain with a king. And when a king like me finds his queen-to-be and his sister in danger, he does not bargain.
The storm didn't just rough up a few sails. It tore our crusade apart like cloth. One moment we were a fleet, orderly, confident, moving east with banners snapping and men telling themselves they were chosen. The next, we were scattered across the sea, each ship alone in black water, each captain fighting the same ugly truth. The wind doesn't care who you are. When dawn finally came, the Mediterranean looked innocent again, blue-gray, cold, endless. But my fleet was broken into pieces, and the worst news reached me quickly. My sister Joan and my intended queen, Berengaria, had been blown off course. They were off Cyprus, near Limassol, and the island's ruler was already circling them like a vulture. Cyprus was supposed to be a footnote on my journey. Instead, it became a test. The man who held the island was Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine noble by blood, a rebel by habit, and, most importantly, a man with just enough power to become arrogant. He styled himself an emperor, but he ruled like a pirate with a crown. He saw wrecked ships and stranded nobles and thought, ransom. He saw my sister and my future wife and thought, leverage. And on that day, he made the worst mistake of his life. Some of my men had already washed up on Cyprus. They were seized, beaten, thrown into prisons. Their gear was taken, their property stolen. Isaac's soldiers prowled the shore looking for more survivors, because a storm is a harvest if you're the kind of man who profits from misery. Berengaria and Joan stayed aboard their ship, smart women. They refused Isaac's invitations to come ashore. They refused his promises of safe escort.
They fought off attempts to board. They knew exactly what kind of man he was. When I arrived and learned what was happening, I didn't call for more negotiations. I didn't send gifts. I didn't ask permission. I demanded that Isaac release the prisoners and return what he had taken. He refused. So I attacked. It began the way so many of my wars began, fast, clean, and with no room for doubt. My ships lowered boats. My archers began to shoot. My men pulled hard toward the beach, oars biting the water, spray stinging eyes. When the keel scraped sand, I was already on my feet. I leapt into shallow surf, sword in hand, and charged straight into the barricades. That isn't poetry. That's how you survive a landing. You hit before the defenders can settle into courage. You break them in the first moments, before fear becomes discipline. The Cypriot line, poorly trained, poorly led, buckled and ran. We took Limassol and secured the shoreline. And suddenly, the women Isaac had hoped to capture were protected by my banners instead. Isaac retreated inland and gathered his army a few miles away. He sent word that he would give battle the next day, as if I'd patiently wait for him to feel ready. He didn't understand who I was. That night, while his men slept, I brought my horses ashore, quietly, carefully. A horse fresh off a ship isn't a weapon until you've worked it, calmed it, reminded it that land is solid. My handlers moved through the darkness like craftsmen, not warriors, hands on bridles, low voices, steady steps. Before dawn, my cavalry was ready. When Isaac opened his eyes the next morning, he didn't find a battlefield he could choose. He found his camp ringed by mounted knights. The sight alone broke his nerve. His soldiers ran again. Some never even got their helmets on. Isaac himself escaped, but he fled so fast he left behind treasure, weapons, horses, and that ridiculous imperial standard meant to announce his greatness. In war, that's what a king takes first. Not the gold, not the gear, the confidence. And with Isaac's confidence shattered, Cyprus began to fall like a door without hinges. Now here's the part people misunderstand when they hear this story. They hear Richard conquered Cyprus and picture a vanity project, a side quest, a detour for personal glory. It wasn't. Cyprus was a supply base, a staging ground, a safe harbor between Europe and the Levant, a place where ships could regroup, repair, and resupply. If you want to fight in the Holy Land, you need bread and water more than you need speeches. You need a port that won't betray you the moment you turn your back. Cyprus gave us that, and it gave me something else, a safe place to complete the marriage my crusade demanded. In Limassol, I married Berengaria. The chapel was stone and candlelight. The air smelled of incense and sea salt. It wasn't a love story, at least not the kind troubadours like to sell. It was a political bond, a necessary alliance, a queen chosen as much for borders as for beauty. Berengaria stood beside me with calm composure, as if she already understood that the life of a queen is often lived in the shadow of a war. For a brief moment, the crusade felt almost orderly again. There was ceremony, there was ritual, there was the illusion that the world was still governed by vows. Then the war returned, as it always does. Isaac kept running. He tried to hide in other fortresses, tried to bargain through intermediaries, tried to delay in the hope that I would grow bored or be forced to sail on. But Cyprus isn't large enough to disappear in. My men moved from stronghold to stronghold, tightening control. Some places surrendered at the sight of us, others resisted briefly and then broke. Eventually, Isaac offered to surrender. He asked for one condition: don't put me in irons. That detail matters because it tells you exactly what he feared. Not defeat, he had already lost. Not death, he expected ransom and survival. What he couldn't bear was the humiliation of chains, the public message of submission. I agreed. And then, because I am exactly the kind of man my enemies should have taken more seriously, I had him bound in chains made of silver. It's a story that people repeat because it sounds like me, sharp, theatrical, cruel in a way that smiles. Whether every link was truly silver, or whether the story grew in the telling, the meaning is clear. Isaac wanted dignity, and he earned mockery. With Isaac secured, Cyprus was ours. I didn't stay to enjoy it. I left administrators and officers to hold it, I secured the stores, and I turned my face back towards the real war, the war I had come for in the first place. Acre was still bleeding. Saladin was still strong. Jerusalem was a wound in Christendom's pride. As my ships pulled away from Cyprus, the sea finally looked calm. Golden light on water, sails breathing steadily in the wind. The convoy tightened into formation. Pennons snapped, lions and crosses, vows and threats. Men worked the ropes with the quiet competence of those who have learned that weather is as dangerous as any enemy. I stood at the prow, feeling the salt wind and the weight of what waited ahead. Cyprus had been a test, and it had been a warning. A king can't afford to be predictable. The world is full of small tyrants who think they can profit from chaos, and the Crusade was nothing but chaos stretched across continents. Now the shoreline of the Levant lay ahead, and with it the name that mattered more than any other, Saladin.
When I finally reached Acre, it didn't look like a holy war. It looked like the end of the world. 2 years of siege had turned the land around the city into a dead zone. Scorched earth, broken carts, shattered timber, and the slow, sour stink of too many bodies living too close to each other. The air tasted like smoke and waste. The ground was churned into filth. Men coughed, sweated, and stared at the walls, as if the stone itself had become personal. Acre sat there like a stubborn tooth, refusing to be pulled. By the time my fleet appeared off the coast in the summer of 1191, the Crusader camp was already exhausted. They had been chewing on this fortress for months, watching friends die from disease and heat before they ever touched an enemy blade. Some had lost hope. Others had turned hope into bitterness, the kind that makes men dangerous. Philip had arrived before me. He always did that. Arrive early, arrive quietly, and make sure everyone understood that he was present. He had set up his camp, placed his engines, and argued with the local lords about politics in the Crusader states. He didn't need to win battles to feel powerful. He needed to control the narrative. When I landed, the camp changed. You could feel it in the way men moved. Heads turned, voices lifted. The arrival of a king with fresh troops and fresh supplies is like rain in drought. For a moment, hope returns. I didn't waste that moment. I had brought something many others hadn't: preparation. Siege equipment pre-built and shipped across the sea. Timber, rope, iron fittings, engineers who knew what they were doing. War isn't just courage, it's logistics, timing, and the ability to hit a problem with enough weight that it breaks. We raised engines, we battered walls, we dug and undermined. The pressure tightened. Acre fought back viciously. The defenders had their own technology, their own tricks, incendiaries that burst into flame, black smoke, burning pitch that clung to wood and cloth. The fire didn't care who you were. It took men screaming into the dirt. And then sickness took its turn. Both Philip and I fell ill during the siege, a wretched disease, something that made the body betray itself, that stripped men down until all that remained was fever and weakness. There were moments when it looked as if I might die there, outside the city I'd come to conquer, swallowed by the same camp filth that had killed so many before me. But I refused to disappear. If my body wouldn't carry me, my men carried me. They brought me to the front in a litter so I could still see the line, still give orders, still be the visible spine of the army. In a world like ours, a king's presence is a weapon. Take it away, and fear spreads through your ranks like rot. So I stayed visible. And Acre finally broke. In July, the city surrendered.
The gates opened. Crusader banners rose over the walls. English lions, French lilies, the crosses of the military orders. The moment should have felt clean, like a victory in a song. It didn't. Victory never is. Victory is always a mess of arguments and blood and exhaustion. And right away, the arguments began. A man named Leopold of Austria, connected, proud, but with only a small force, raised his banner alongside ours as if he were our equal. It might sound like a small insult. It wasn't. In the medieval world, banners are claims. Claims to honor, to status, to loot, to territory. When you let a lesser lord stand as your equal, you invite every other lesser lord to try the same. So, the banner came down. People remember that moment because it feels petty. But petty moments in politics are often the ones that shape fate. Leopold would never forget the humiliation, and years later, when I was traveling home, that resentment would become the chain around my wrists. But the more immediate problem inside Acre wasn't banners, it was prisoners. The city surrendered left thousands of captives in my hands, men who defended Acre, now disarmed and waiting. In our world, prisoners were currency. You could ransom them, exchange them, trade them for political advantage. War was brutal, but it was also transactional. We negotiated with Saladin. The agreement was that he would pay and return Christian prisoners in exchange. The trouble was, negotiations were slow, and Saladin, as clever as any king, had his own reasons to delay. Every day I waited was a day he gained time to gather forces, strengthen positions, and prepare for what came next. And I couldn't simply sit in Acre feeding thousands of prisoners while my army rotted in place. I wanted to move, south, towards Jaffa, towards the coastline that would allow us to threaten Jerusalem, towards the next phase of the war. When the deadline passed and the terms were not met, the decision came down like a stone. I ordered the prisoners executed. This is the part of my story that people either excuse too easily or condemn too easily, depending on what they want the legend to be. Let's be honest, it was horrific. It was also, in the logic of the age, a ruthless solution to a problem that could not be left unresolved. I could not release thousands of fighting men to take up arms behind me. I could not feed them indefinitely, and I could not let Saladin use delay as a leash around my strategy. So blood answered where diplomacy stalled. That decision followed me like a shadow. It always will. After that, there was no mistaking what kind of war this was. Not a clean duel between noble leaders, a brutal clash between worlds, where mercy and cruelty were both tools, and where faith was braided tightly into violence. And yet, after that darkness, my army began to move with renewed purpose. We marched along the coast, because the sea was our lifeline. Ships could follow us, supplying food and water. Without that, any march inland would be suicide. The land belonged to Saladin. The desert, the heat, the wells, everything could be turned against us. Saladin's cavalry followed like wolves. Mounted archers swept in, shot, and withdrew. They tried to lure our knights into chasing them, because that's how you kill heavy cavalry. You pull it out of formation, loses cohesion, and then you're surrounded. That's how armies die. The moment had to be perfect. And then discipline cracked, not from my command, but from desperation. The Hospitallers, unable to endure the pounding any longer, charged without orders. They burst out too early, disrupting the infantry in front of them, risking everything. This was the instant where a great army can become a massacre. I didn't hesitate. If I punished them in that moment, the line would collapse. If I waited, their charge would be isolated and destroyed. So I did the only thing left. I ordered the full charge. The entire Crusader line surged forward as one. Templars, Hospitallers, English, Normans, Bretons, steel and horseflesh and will, crashing into the enemy when they were crowded too tightly to escape. The impact was devastating. Men and horses fell. Dust swallowed the field. Saladin's line broke, rallied, and came back in a counterattack. The battle turned again, and then, because I had held reserves, I struck once more, driving into the enemy at the critical moment. Arsuf ended as a Crusader victory. Saladin withdrew. The myth of his invincibility, if it ever truly existed, was wounded. My army, battered but intact, marched on. 3 days later, we entered Jaffa, securing a port that mattered. But the war didn't end with a victory. It never does. Jerusalem was still out there, breathing behind its walls, and every man in my army could feel how close it was. Close enough to dream of. Close enough to ruin us if we tried to seize it without being able to hold it. And while I stood on that shoreline, looking inland, knowing the holy city was near but not yet mine, another war began to tug at my cloak from across the sea. Because in the west, my brother John was stirring, and Philip, who had abandoned the crusade, was already preparing to strike at my lands again. I had come east to fight for Christendom, but now the hard truth rose in front of me like a wall of its own. I would have to turn back. And the price of turning back would echo for the rest of my life.
Arsuf should have been the moment when everything opened. We had beaten Saladin in the field. We had taken Jaffa. We had the sea at our backs and a road inland that, on a map, looked simple. Jerusalem sat there like a promise, close enough to imagine, close enough to taste. But war doesn't run on maps. It runs on food, water, weather, and the fragile tempers of men who think they deserve a kingdom when they haven't earned it. After the battle, my army moved south along the coast, with the sea glittering beside us and the enemy's land stretching inland like a warning. Saladin didn't need to stand still and fight me again right away. He could bleed us instead. He could circle. He could harass. He could strike our weak points, the baggage train, the foragers, the tired horses. And he did. Day after day, mounted archers rode in from the scrub, loosed arrows, and vanished again into the heat. The air around us was often full of shafts. You'd look down and see men marching with arrows lodged in their padding, in their shields, sometimes even hooked into the rings of their mail. It was ugly and constant, the kind of pressure that wears down the mind. The knights wanted to charge. They always did. Heavy cavalry is built for impact, for the satisfaction of contact, for the moment when steel meets flesh and everything is decided. But this enemy wouldn't give us that moment unless it was on his terms. If my knights broke formation too soon, they'd chase shadows, lose cohesion, and get cut apart. So I held them back. I rode along the line again and again, ordering discipline, ordering patience, ordering men to endure. And then, near Arsuf, discipline finally snapped, not because I chose it, but because it was forced. The Hospitaliers broke and charged early. They couldn't take it anymore. They burst forward like a dam giving way, and in doing so, they threatened to tear the whole army apart. That instant could have been our ruin. I didn't punish them. I didn't argue. I didn't hesitate. I turned the mistake into the signal and unleashed the whole line. That is the part people like to remember. The thunder of the mass charge, the shock of armored horses slamming into packed ranks, the enemy forced to absorb a blow they couldn't simply slip away from. We won that day because we held ourselves together long enough for the enemy to be trapped by his own aggression. Arsuf was a victory, a real one, the kind that makes armies breathe again. And a few days later, we marched into Jaffa. Jaffa mattered. A port is not just a city, it's a lifeline. If we were going to threaten Jerusalem, we needed a secure sea gate for supplies, grain, water, replacements, everything that keeps an army from starving into defeat. But the closer we got to Jerusalem, the clearer the problem became. Taking the city was possible. Holding it was another question entirely. We argued endlessly. The local lords of the Crusader states had their own rivalries, their own grudges, their own claims. They wanted to win Jerusalem, yes, but they also wanted to make sure the victory served their interests. Every council became a battlefield of words. I wanted to move decisively. If the enemy is weak, you strike. If a fortress is weak, you strike. Hesitation is where war goes to die. But I wasn't the king of everyone in that camp.
I was the leader of an expedition made up of proud men from many lands, men who believed their banners gave them equal voices. I could command, I could inspire, I could threaten, but I couldn't turn a crusade into a simple monarchy. So we fortified Jaffa when I wanted to push elsewhere. We marched inland when others felt confident, and then we found ourselves trapped by weather, terrain, and the cold logic of logistics. Heavy rain turned the roads into mud. Supply lines became vulnerable. The enemy could cut us off, starve us, and force another disaster like Hatton. In the end, we came close enough to feel the holy city's presence, close enough to imagine standing on its walls, and I ordered the retreat. Not because I was afraid to fight, because I was afraid to win something I could not keep. That is a hard truth for people who only want heroes. Sometimes the brave choice is not the dramatic charge. Sometimes the brave choice is telling your men to turn around when their hearts are screaming to go forward. Back on the coast, we regrouped. The war continued in smaller ways: ambushes, scouting fights, constant tension. There were moments when my small escort was attacked, and we countercharged with only a handful of knights, cutting a path out through dust and arrows. There were days I could feel the strain in every bone, and then sickness hit me again, dragging my body down while my mind stayed awake. And then the message came from the west: England, Normandy, my brother John, Philip of France. The words on that parchment hit harder than any arrow, because they weren't just news, they were the shape of betrayal. John was stirring at home, gathering support, testing loyalties, hoping my absence had created space for him to step into. And Philip, who had abandoned the Crusade, was moving against my lands in France, trying to carve away Normandy while I was still far away under the sun. I had come east to fight for Christendom, but I could not allow my inheritance to be dismantled behind my back. Not by Philip, not by John. If I lost Normandy, the entire Angevin structure cracked. If I lost England's loyalty, everything followed. And if I stayed too long, the damage could become irreversible. So I made the decision I hated. I would go home. Some people imagine that a Crusader king can simply choose glory over politics, faith over borders, and let the realm sort itself out. That's a fairy tale. A king is not allowed to be pure. A king is allowed to be responsible. And responsibility pulled me west. We prepared ships. We tightened schedules. We readied men who had already marched and bled and wanted to keep going east. I could see it in their faces, the disappointment, the anger, the quiet fear that we were leaving the story unfinished. I felt it too. As my fleet slipped away from the Levant, there was a moment when I stood at the rail and looked inland, towards roads that led to Jerusalem. The city was not visible from the sea, but it was present in the mind like a wound. I wondered what history would say. I wondered what men would whisper. I wondered whether victory without the holy city would ever feel like a half victory. But the sea doesn't wait for a king's doubts. We sailed. The banners snapped in the wind, my lions beside the Crusader cross, two identities tied together, the warrior and the ruler, the man who wanted to finish the holy war, and the king who knew he couldn't. Night after night, the fleet moved across water that looked calm, until it didn't. Lanterns swayed, rigging creaked, the sky changed its mind as it always does. And as the coastline faded behind us, I understood something bitter. War had not ended. It had only shifted its battlefield. I was leaving one enemy behind and sailing straight towards another. Because somewhere ahead, past winter seas and foreign shores, waited Europe again, filled with men who smiled like allies and plotted like thieves. And the cruelest irony of all was this: the Crusade had tested my sword. Now the West would test my throne.
I left the Holy Land in the autumn of 1192, and I left it with the taste of unfinished business still in my mouth. We had taken Acre. We had won at Arsuf. We had secured Jaffa. We had proved, at least for a moment, that Saladin could be beaten. But Jerusalem remained out of reach. and every mile my ships carried me west felt like a bargain I didn't want to make. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself a king can't let his realm burn while he chases a holy dream. And then the sea reminded me how little control any king truly has. The voyage home was rough. Winds turned, waves rose, and the Mediterranean became the same enemy it had been in Sicily and Cyprus, an enemy without banners, without mercy, without negotiation. We pushed on anyway, because time mattered. The longer I stayed away, the more space Philip and John would have to move. Somewhere along the Adriatic, near the Dalmatian coast, disaster struck. Ships wrecked, men clung to splintered timber, chests and barrels disappeared into foam, cold salt water swallowed prayers. We made it ashore, wet and bruised, and for a brief moment it felt like we'd survived the worst. We hadn't. Winter was coming, and the seas were too dangerous to keep sailing. So I made a decision that would haunt me. Instead of staying with the safety of the fleet, I would travel overland through Europe with only a small party. Faster, quieter, less visible. At least, that was the hope. To avoid attention, I disguised myself as a pilgrim, a rough cloak over a life that had been anything but rough, a hood over a face that half of Christendom knew. Even my body betrayed the disguise, too tall, too recognizable, too used to command. You can hide a crown, you can't hide a reputation. We moved through villages and forests, along muddy roads and frosty rivers. We slept in inns where smoke stung the eyes and strangers watched too carefully. We tried to look like ordinary men, but ordinary men don't carry themselves the way kings do. Ordinary men don't have hands shaped by rain leather and sword grip. Suspicion followed us like a hound. The world knew I was traveling home. The world knew a king from the Crusade was worth more than gold, and there was a man in Europe who wanted payment for a humiliation he couldn't forget. Leopold of Austria. Back at Acre, his banner had been torn down. A small insult, some would say, but for men like Leopold, status is oxygen. Take it away, and they suffocate on rage. Now he had a chance to do what petty pride dreams of, to make the great man kneel. Near Vienna, in the cold of December, his agents caught me. It wasn't a heroic capture, no grand battle, just a road, a trap, and the moment you realize you are surrounded by men who already know your name. Crossbows raised, horses blocking the way, cold breath in the air. I could have fought. I chose not to. Not because I lacked courage, but because I understood the stakes. A king killed in some roadside skirmish would be a disaster for everything I was trying to protect. Alive, I was still a problem for my enemies. Alive, I could still command loyalty. Alive, I could still come back. So I surrendered with as much dignity as the moment allowed. Leopold locked me behind a fortress above the river. Stone walls, narrow windows, damp air. The church claimed crusaders should be protected, that a man returning from holy war should not be seized. But laws are only words if power doesn't fear breaking them. Leopold didn't fear. He saw profit. And he feared something else even more, that someone stronger would steal his prize. So he sold me. He handed me over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, a man with an empire's appetite and a politician's cold eyes. In one move, Leopold turned his petty revenge into a continental bargaining chip. Christendom was appalled. Priests thundered about injustice. There were threats of excommunication, moral outrage, all the proper noises. But outrage doesn't open a prison door. Gold does. In the imperial court, they staged a kind of trial. Accusations were read, oath-breaking, treachery, crimes in the Holy Land, whatever they thought might stick. Some of it was nonsense, some of it was political theater. They wanted to make my captivity look righteous instead of greedy. So I did the only thing left to me. I stood there and I spoke.
I spoke like a king, not like a prisoner. I answered the accusations with controlled words, with the steadiness of a man who refuses to look small. The hall watched, princes listened, bishops murmured. Even my enemies had to admit there was something unsettling about a captive who still carried himself as if he were free. And for a moment, it worked. The emperor dropped the worst of the charges. He offered formal reconciliation. He even kissed me in peace, as if we were equals, rather than a captor and a hostage. Then he named the price. He wanted an enormous ransom, not a symbolic sum, not a polite fine, a king's price. Now, this is where modern ears often stumble, because medieval money doesn't land naturally in the mind. Don't picture some tidy number on a screen. Picture weight. Picture wagons. Picture silver being dragged out of churches in baronial vaults. Picture people across England and the Angevin lands forced to contribute, not because they loved me, but because their own stability depended on the crown not being humiliated. The realm began to pay. Nobles gave what they could, partly out of duty, partly because they knew generosity bought favor. Officials assessed special taxes. Churches surrendered plate and treasure. Clerks counted and sealed and recorded. The country didn't collapse into ruin overnight, but the burden was real, felt in households, felt in parish chests, felt in the way people learned that even a king's pride has a price tag. And while I sat behind stone walls, my enemies moved. Philip of France, freed from crusading responsibility, pressed into my lands on the continent. He took castles, he bribed men, he promised rewards to those willing to change sides. He was doing what he always did, winning with time. John, my brother, saw the opening too. He spread rumors that I was dead. He flirted with the idea of taking the crown for himself. He gathered allies and tested the realm's loyalty like a thief testing a lock. Some raids and invasions were attempted. Some were beaten back by hurried defenses. The system I had built before leaving England held better than my enemies expected, but the danger was obvious. If I stayed locked up long enough, the realm could fracture. That's why Philip and John tried something desperate. They offered the emperor money to keep me imprisoned. Think about that. Two men so afraid of my return that they were willing to pay not to win, but simply to delay, to buy time, to keep the devil caged. But the emperor's court was not entirely on their side. Powerful princes within the empire wanted to keep faith, keep reputation, keep order. They pushed Henry to honor the agreement. The ransom payments continued. The pressure mounted. And at last, after more than a year, the chain began to loosen. When the gates finally opened, I stepped out not as a broken man, but as a storm delayed. Philip would later send a message to John, words that became famous because they captured the truth in one line. Look to yourself, the devil is loose. I don't know if he meant it as hatred or as a warning, maybe both. I only know this. The moment I was free, the game changed again. Because my enemies were never afraid of my titles, they were afraid of my momentum. And now the momentum was coming home.
When I set foot on English soil again, it didn't feel like a homecoming. It felt like a blade sliding back into a sheath. Cold air, mud underfoot, a kingdom that had held its breath for more than a year, listening to rumors, some saying I was alive, some saying I was dead, some saying I'd never return at all. My enemies had acted exactly as I knew they would. Philip had been gnawing at my lands in France. John had been stirring trouble in England, testing loyalties, buying friends, and letting people imagine, even for a moment, that he might become king simply because I wasn't there to stop him. I didn't waste time on speeches. A king who comes back from captivity and starts with ceremony is a king who doesn't understand what just happened. I started with pressure. Nottingham Castle became the symbol of the problem. John's men holding a fortress as if the crown belonged to them. You can't let that stand, not even for a day,
because the moment you allow one rebellion to look successful, you invite 10 more. So, I marched. The siege was fast by medieval standards, but it wasn't clean. Stone walls don't care who you are. A castle is a machine built to waste your time. Ladders break, men slip in mud. Arrows strike shields with dull, ugly thuds. You don't win a siege by bravery alone. You win it by making the defenders feel certainty. Certainty that you will not go away. That's what I brought back with me. I planted my banners where they could be seen. I brought engines up. I pressed the lines. And when resistance hardened, I made sure the defenders understood exactly what defiance would cost. There's no gentle way to say it. Medieval war runs on fear as much as on faith. In the end, Nottingham yielded. The king was back, and the castle could no longer pretend otherwise. Then came the next question, the one everyone wanted to see answered. What would I do to my brother? John came to me the way men come to the only power left in the room. He knelt, he asked forgiveness, he tried to make himself small enough to survive. People today like to imagine that the proper response would have been swift, final punishment, a clean execution, a neat ending. But kings don't always have the luxury of neat endings. John had been a traitor, yes. He had been reckless, yes. But he was also useful. He had followers, he had lands, he had influence. If I destroyed him completely, I risked creating a martyr for the discontented, and I risked driving his allies into a deeper rebellion. So I did what my father had done to me. I forgave. Not warmly, not kindly. I forgave in a way that reminded everyone watching that mercy can be a weapon, that pardon can be a leash, that a brother who betrays you can be made to live under your shadow. And if I spoke to him with contempt, if I let him feel publicly how small I believed him to be, that was part of the lesson. John wasn't a child, not really, but treating him like one was the coldest kind of discipline. It told him and the court that I would decide what he was allowed to be. With England stabilized, I did something that surprises people who think I never cared about ruling. I reorganized. I didn't just swing a sword and leave. I used the law. I opened proceedings against the worst offenders. I restored order through administration, through appointments, through the machinery of government that my father had built and I had learned to use. England didn't need me standing in Westminster every day. It needed the system to work in my name. And once it did, I turned back to the true battlefield, Normandy. Because that was where Philip had been biting hardest, and that was where my inheritance could be broken beyond repair if I hesitated. When I crossed back over the Channel, I wasn't returning to the kind of war people imagine, one glorious, decisive battle between two kings on a bright field. Philip didn't fight like that. He never wanted to. He moved like water. He moved around obstacles. He wore you down. He bribed your allies. He promised rewards, then punished hesitation. He took castles rather than risks. He avoided the one thing I wanted most, a pitched battle that could decide everything. I tried to force it, again and again. I marched hard. I struck quickly. I retook towns that had been lost. I smashed smaller strongholds before they could become problems. I pressed pressure until Philip had to respond, then watched him turn away at the last moment, refusing to be trapped. It was maddening, because a king like me, raised in war, trained for impact, wants the moment where the enemy stands still and agrees by his presence to be beaten. Philip wouldn't give me that gift. So I beat him in the ways I could. I broke his operations. I caught rear guards. I captured engines. I seized supplies. I forced his men into retreats that looked orderly from far away and panicked up close. There were moments when his army disintegrated simply because my pursuit had shattered their confidence. Men don't have to be slaughtered to be defeated. Sometimes they just have to believe suddenly that the lion is behind them. And when I won, I didn't just take treasure, I took information.
Archives, letters, lists of names, the quiet proof of which lords had been willing to turn on me if Philip offered enough. That knowledge was as valuable as any castle. It told me where to apply pressure and where to cut away rot. Meanwhile, the realm kept moving because I kept it moving. That's the hidden truth of this part of my reign. It was a constant balance of violence and administration, siege and parchment, steel and seal. I couldn't afford to be only a warrior, not with a rival like Philip, not with the fragile structure of my lands. And through it all, John stayed near, subdued, useful, and never entirely trusted. I had pulled him back to my side, and that alone changed the war. Philip could no longer rely on my brother to cause chaos behind me. But I also understood something that only kings really learn. You don't cure ambition, you only manage it. Still, for a time, the momentum was mine again. Castles fell. Towns returned to obedience, my line stabilized, the system tightened around the realm like a strap pulled firm. This is why my enemies feared my return from captivity. Not because I was a better man than they were, or purer, or more righteous, but because I moved like a force of nature. I didn't pause long enough for them to breathe. And yet, even as the tide turned in my favor, I could feel the cost in my body. Old wounds ached. Illness had left marks. The years of constant campaigning had hardened me, but they had also worn me down. That's the danger of living as if you are unstoppable. You forget that time is always working on you, even when your enemies aren't. Philip understood time. He lived by it. I fought it. And in those years, with England secured behind me, and Normandy burning ahead of me, the war became what it would remain until the end of my life. Not a single story with one climax, but a relentless struggle, day after day, between a man who wanted decisive victory and a rival who believed patience could outlast a sword.
I chose the rock above the Seine because I could feel the war in the shape of the land. If you stand at Les Andelys and look down at the river, you understand Normandy in a single breath. The Seine bends there like a spine. Barges move along it like blood through a vein. Armies follow rivers. Supplies follow rivers. And if you can lock that passage with stone, you can make an enemy bleed time. That was the point. Philip would not give me the battle I wanted. He avoided open field decisions the way a careful man avoids a knife. So I decided to force the war into a different shape, one he couldn't sidestep. I would build a fortress so aggressive it felt like an insult. Chateau Gaillard, my saucy castle, a cliff-top fist clenched over the river. People imagine castles as things that simply exist, as if they grow from the ground like trees. They don't. They are made, stone, by men with blistered hands and aching backs. They are bought with coin, timber, iron, and the most valuable currency of all, time. And time was the one thing I refused to give Philip. So I pushed the work like a campaign. Surveyors paced the clifftop with rope lines and stakes. Master masons argued angles and curves. I stood over the plans and traced the walls with my finger, not like a dreamer, but like a man marking the cuts he was about to make. I wanted concentric defenses, tight curves, towers that could rake every approach. I wanted a fortress that punished anyone who tried to stand near it. Below, in the chalk and limestone, the quarrymen began to break the earth open. You could hear it, hammer on wedge, the sharp crack when stone finally gave way. Blocks were squared and hauled onto carts. Oxen leaned into yokes until their shoulders trembled. Wheels sank into mud and groaned free again. On the river, barges carried pale limestone under morning fog, slipping along the Seine as quietly as prayers. Then, the site itself turned into a living machine. Wooden scaffolds rose, laced with rope. Treadwheel cranes creaked as men walked inside them like trapped animals, lifting stones that would crush a man if a knot failed. Mortar steamed faintly in cold air. Plumb lines swung in the wind. Every part of the work demanded precision, because a fortress is not impressive if it collapses before the enemy ever touches it. I watched, I paced, I ordered. Not from comfort either. I lived there, by the river, on the slope, near the noise and sweat, because a project like that cannot be half-led. Workers slow down when they think the king has turned away. They speed up when they feel him close, when they know the eyes above them are not just the foreman's. And while stone rose, I built something else alongside it, a base. A lodge by the river, a place to plan campaigns, to receive messengers, to sleep close to the point of pressure. A new town took shape across from the cliff, streets marked by stakes, huts and workshops appearing, merchants arriving because men always follow construction, and armies always create markets. You could feel it. I wasn't just defending Normandy, I was reshaping it. Of course, Philip saw what I was doing. He had eyes everywhere. Scouts watched from wooded ridges across the river, sketching the silhouette as the walls climbed higher. His envoys listened in towns. His agents paid for rumors the way other men pay for bread. Philip didn't need to strike the castle while it rose. He only needed to keep me fighting elsewhere long enough that the work faltered. So, he kept the war alive at the edges. Small raids on supply trains, skirmishes in muddy lanes, attacks that came at dusk and vanished into the trees. It was never quiet for long. Even the days when no battle happened felt like the pause between breaths before another blow. More than once, I rode out to stabilize a line myself. That's the danger of being the kind of king I was. When things get tight, you want to put your own hands on the problem. You want to force it to obey. And war always charges a price for that habit. There was a day in the field when a bolt found my leg, my knee, sharp pain and sudden stiffness. Nothing glorious about it, just a reminder that the body is not made of legend, no matter what songs say. The surgeon wrapped the wound, tightened linen, tied knots, and I stood again because I couldn't afford to be seen as breakable. Work continued, war continued. Chateau Gaillard rose fast. Outer walls, inner walls, round towers, curves designed to deflect blows and trap attackers in killing angles. The fortress began to look less like a building and more like a challenge thrown into Philip's face. And Philip, for all his caution, could not ignore a challenge forever. The campaigns around Normandy escalated. Philip moved, I moved. He withdrew when I tried to pin him. He preferred to retreat rather than gamble his kingdom on one day's fighting. It infuriated me because I could feel the decisive battle hovering just out of reach, like a dream you can't finish. So, I took what I could take. I struck where he didn't expect. I pressured his rear guards. I seized tools and engines. I pushed him until his men began to crack. Not always into rout, but into the kind of disorder that makes retreat turn into humiliation. There was a moment, rain starting, mud deep, man exhausted, when Philip's baggage train became vulnerable. Wagons jammed, horses panicked. A bridge, simple timber, overloaded, began to groan under weight and fear. And then, it failed. Wood snapped, men and gear plunged into cold water. The river swallowed armor like a stone. I didn't need a grand battle to win that day. I needed the enemy to break his own footing. When the dust settled, I had something better than loot. I had leverage. Royal tents, equipment, supplies, and more importantly, archives. Bundles of parchment, seals, lists of names naming names, lists of lords willing to bargain their loyalty away. That kind of intelligence is a weapon you can't see until it cuts. I read those documents by candlelight, smoke curling above the flame, and I understood the war in a new way. It wasn't only on the battlefield. It was in promises, bribes, and the quiet decisions men make when they think the king is too far away to punish them. Chateau Gaillard was my answer to that, too. A statement in stone. I am here. I am watching. I am not going away. When the fortress was finally complete, it dominated the Seine like a blade held over a throat. Pale walls on chalk, towers with clean lines, multiple layers that made attack feel foolish. My banner, 3 lions, flying high where everyone could see it. I stood on the walk in the wind and looked down at the river, at the town, at the roads that led towards France. I knew Philip would come for it eventually. He would test it, the way he tested everything. But I also knew I had built something that forced him to deal with me on ground I had chosen. That was my art in those years. If I couldn't get the battle I wanted, I would build the battlefield I needed. And as the morning mist rolled through the valley below my new fortress, One thought sat heavy in my chest, half pride, half warning. A castle like this does not only defend, it provokes. It dares the world to try.
It ended the way no one writes legends. Not with a great battle, not with a crowned farewell in a cathedral. It ended on a damp hillside in Limousin, beneath a small, stubborn castle that shouldn't have mattered at all. It was early spring, 1199. The air still carried winter in its bones. The ground was soft with mud. Torches smoked in the evening wind as my men tightened the siege around Châlus. Stone walls, a few towers, and a garrison small enough that most kings would have sent a lieutenant and kept riding. But I was not most kings. I never learned how to stay back. I stood near the front line, close enough to see the uneven stones in the wall, close enough to hear the defenders shifting behind crenellations, close enough to feel the familiar pull of certainty. This will be quick, this will be easy, this is beneath me. Somewhere above, a crossbowman watched. Not a knight, not a lord, just a man with a weapon and a sliver of courage left. He loaded the bow with the kind of practiced motion you only get from repetition, slow, careful, economical. He leaned out, aimed, and released. The bolt hit my shoulder. For a moment, the world reduced itself to one sensation: impact, heat, and the sharp realization that steel does not care about titles. I did not fall. I refused to fall. A king collapsing in front of his men is not just a man losing balance, it's the army losing belief. So I did what I had always done. I controlled my face. I controlled my voice. I turned away as if it were nothing and walked back toward my tent. Inside, in the warmer light of candles and a brazier, I finally let my body react. The pain arrived fully, like a door kicked open. The bolt was still there, buried deep. I made the mistake soldiers make when they've survived too much. They grabbed the shaft and yanked. The wood snapped. The iron head stayed inside me. When the surgeon arrived, he brought linen, blades, forceps, and that hard calm men wear when they work close to death. They held me still. They cut deep. They searched. They pulled. The pain was not noble. It was not heroic. It was simply real, heavy, ugly, unavoidable. At last, the iron head came free with a hard clink into a dish, and for a brief moment I could breathe again. They wrapped the wound tight. They cleaned it with wine and vinegar, as men did. They told me to rest. I tried. But rest is difficult when you've lived your life in motion. Rest feels like surrender. Outside the tent, the siege continued. Men shouted orders. Hammers struck wood. The castle, insultingly small, still resisted. I could hear the war going on without me, and it felt unnatural, as if the world had forgotten its proper center. Then the fever came. It started softly, a sheen of sweat, a chill that didn't match the air, a dull ache spreading outward from the wound, as if my body were arguing with itself. Within a day, the pain changed character. It grew, deeper, heavier, more certain. That's the thing about infection. It doesn't announce itself like an enemy charge. It arrives like a rumor, and by the time you realize it's true, it's everywhere. I knew what it meant. I had seen men take it before. Gangrene doesn't care about courage. It doesn't bargain with kings. So I did what a king must do when the body begins to fail. I put my affairs in order. I dictated letters. I gave instructions. I sent messengers. And I wrote to my mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Even in my fever, I could picture her clearly. Old now, yes, but still fierce, still unbent by time. She had carried empires on her back and survived prisons, betrayals, and the slow cruelty of politics. If anyone could stand at the edge of my death without collapsing, it was her. While I waited, the castle fell, not because it was truly strong, only because it had taken long enough. The defenders surrendered, and among them was the man who had shot me. They brought him to my tent. He stood before me,
small and terrified, holding on to the last scraps of dignity a common soldier can claim. And in that moment, I did something that people still argue about because it doesn't fit cleanly into the story they want. I pardoned him. Not because the bolt didn't matter, not because I suddenly became gentle, but because I understood the strange logic of war. A man who fights for his lord, who holds a wall when everything is lost, is doing exactly what he is supposed to do. So I gave him a gift, 100 shillings, a sum meant to be remembered. A king's mercy at the edge of death is a powerful symbol. It tells the world, even now, I choose how the story ends. But kings don't control everything. After I died, my men did what wounded, grieving soldiers often do. They took revenge. The details vary in the telling, and I won't dress it up as anything other than what it was: anger looking for a place to land. My mother arrived too late to save me, but not too late to see the truth in my face. She stood beside my bed as priests murmured prayers and candles smoked in the stale air. She took my hand, and I felt, briefly, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, not pride, something like being a son again. The chaplain raised a small cross. The words of the rites were spoken. The candle flame trembled in a draught. And then, the room changed. Not dramatically, not like a stage. It changed the way a battlefield changes when the shouting stops. A kind of quiet settles that feels heavier than noise. My breath slowed. My hand went still. The Lionheart was gone. Outside, the camp learned the news and fell into a silence that felt like a wall. Men who had followed me for years stood staring at the ground. Some removed their helmets slowly, as if even that motion required permission. Banners drooped in the damp air. Torches hissed. The siege that seemed so urgent only days before suddenly looked meaningless. They wrapped my body. They lifted it with care. They began the long road of funerals and decisions that always follows the death of a king. And then came the next truth, just as brutal as the first. I had no legitimate heir. My marriage had produced no child to take my place, so the crown passed to my brother, John, the very man I had forgiven, restrained, and tried to keep within my orbit, the man whose ambitions had already proven how dangerous he could be when he thought I was gone. Philip of France, when he heard, did not weep. He did what Philip always did. He looked at a map. He saw openings. He saw time, his favorite ally, finally on his side. And across England and Normandy, people began to argue about what my reign meant. Was I a great king or only a great soldier, a hero or a burden, a legend or a mistake? The answer, of course, is that I was all of it, a king who spent too much time at war and yet kept the realm running through the men he appointed, a warrior whose victories were real and whose cruelty was also real, a ruler whose name became a banner long after the body beneath it was dust. And that is how legends are made, not by perfection, by impact, by a life lived at the front, close enough to be seen, close enough to be feared, close enough to be wounded. Because in the end, what people remember isn't where I was born or what language I spoke. They remember the image, a king in armor, under a hard sky, refusing to step back. And they remember the sound that can end any legend, no matter how loud the songs become afterwards. That blunt, small note, the bolt, the tup.